The first shot rang out just as Rosalyn Winters was pulling water from the well outside her small cabin. She ducked, instinctively, the wooden bucket crashing to the ground as she pressed herself against the rough stone wall. 3 more shots followed in quick succession, each one splintering the wood of her porch. This wasn't the first time Thaddeus Blackwood's men had come to intimidate her, but it was certainly the boldest. As the echoes of gunfire faded into the vast Wyoming landscape, Rosalyn clenched her fists, feeling the familiar calluses that had formed over years of fighting to keep her small piece of land. She'd sworn long ago she'd never know gentle hands in this harsh world, not after what men like Blackwood had done to her family. "You got 1 week, Miss Winters," a gruff voice called out. "Mr. Blackwood ain't asking no more. Sell or burn." Rosalyn peered cautiously around the well. 3 riders were already retreating across her property, dust clouds billowing behind them as they headed back toward town. Her heart hammered in her chest, but it wasn't fear that made her breath come in short gasps, it was rage. At 26, Rosalyn had already endured more than most women twice her age. After losing her parents to typhoid 4 years earlier, she'd fought to maintain their small ranch against mounting debts, drought, and the constant pressure from Thaddeus Blackwood, who seemed determined to absorb every acre of land in Cottonwood County. Rosalyn surveyed the damage to her porch. The bullets had torn through the railing, and one had shattered her mother's prized flower pot. Soil and broken marigolds lay scattered across the weathered boards. She would need to repair it all, and soon. But what she needed more was help, real help, not just the occasional sympathy of townsfolk too afraid of Blackwood to stand against him. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across her land, Rosalyn made a decision. Tomorrow, she would ride into town and speak with Sheriff Miller. Though she had little faith he would stand up to Blackwood, she had to try something. Her options were running out as quickly as her ammunition. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, the late September air carrying the first hints of autumn. Rosalyn saddled her mare, Pepper, and secured her father's old Colt revolver in her belt. The ride into Cottonwood Creek would take nearly an hour, and she wasn't taking chances after yesterday's warning. The town appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden buildings straddling both sides of the main street. Despite its modest size, Cottonwood Creek had grown considerably since the railroad had come through 5 years earlier. New storefronts, a proper hotel, and even a small opera house now stood alongside the original saloon and general store. Rosalyn tethered Pepper outside the sheriff's office and took a steadying breath before pushing open the door. The office was empty save for a young deputy she didn't recognize, his boots propped up on the desk as he cleaned his fingernails with a pocket knife. "Sheriff ain't here," he said without looking up. "Can I help you, miss?" "Where is he?" Rosalyn asked, her voice sharper than she'd intended. The deputy finally glanced up, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. Rosalyn knew what he saw: a woman in men's trousers and a worn cotton shirt, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid, dust from the trail covering her boots. "Out at the Blackwood Ranch," he replied. "Some trouble with rustlers. He'll be back tomorrow, likely. Of course." Whenever Blackwood called, Sheriff Miller came running. Rosalyn turned to leave but paused at the door. "When he returns, tell him Rosalyn Winters needs to report gunfire on her property. Tell him Blackwood's men shot up my home." The deputy sat up straighter. "You sure about that accusation, miss?" "Mr. Blackwood's an important man in these parts." "I know exactly who he is," Rosalyn said coldly. "And yes, I'm sure." She stepped back onto the boardwalk, frustration burning in her chest. With the sheriff unavailable, she would need to stock up on supplies and head back to her ranch. At least she could repair her porch before nightfall. The general store was busier than usual, with several ranch hands picking up supplies and a pair of well-dressed women examining bolts of fabric. Rosalyn nodded politely to Mr. Grayson, the proprietor, as she made her way to the counter. "Miss Winters," he greeted her, his expression sympathetic. "Heard about the trouble at your place. You all right? News travels fast," Rosalyn remarked, pulling her list from her pocket. "I need these items, please." As Mr. Grayson gathered her supplies, the store's bell jingled, announcing another customer. Rosalyn paid little attention until a deep voice spoke just behind her. "You planning to fix that porch all by yourself, Miss Winters?" She turned to find herself looking up at a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long days working outdoors. His eyes were a striking blue against his weathered face, and a slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. Despite his dusty clothes, there was something immediately commanding about his presence. "I've managed worse on my own," she replied coolly. "I don't doubt it," he said, removing his hat to reveal dark hair with hints of copper where the sun had lightened it. "But 4 bullet holes in good lumber is a shame. Name's Elijah Wade, just hired on at the Thompson place. I'm handy with tools, if you'd accept the help." Rosalyn studied him warily. New faces in Cottonwood Creek were rare, and new faces offering help were suspicious. "And why would you help a stranger, Mr. Wade?" "Because I saw those men riding away from your place yesterday," he said, his expression hardening. 3 men threatening 1 woman doesn't sit right with me, never has. Rosalyn felt the eyes of everyone in the store on them. Blackwood had allies everywhere, and accepting help from this stranger might only make her situation worse. Yet something in his direct gaze made her hesitate. "I appreciate the offer, but $2 a day plus meals," he interrupted. "That's my going rate for carpentry work." "I'm not offering charity, Miss Winters, just fair work for fair pay." The practicality of his offer took her by surprise. Her porch did need fixing, and with the harvest coming, she had little time for repairs. $1 a day, she countered, and you bring your own tools. A genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his features. "Done. I'll follow you back to your place when you're ready to leave town." As Elijah turned to make his own purchases, Rosalyn found herself wondering if she had just made a terrible mistake. The last thing she needed was a man on her property, especially one as imposing as Elijah Wade. But as she watched him politely tip his hat to the store ladies while collecting a few items, she reluctantly admitted to herself that having someone to help repair the damage might be worth the risk. An hour later, they rode side by side along the trail leading to her ranch. Elijah had packed his tools on a sturdy pack horse that followed obediently behind his chestnut gelding. They traveled mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Rosalyn found herself stealing glances at her companion, noting the easy way he sat in the saddle and the alert manner in which he surveyed the landscape. "You're not from around here," she finally said, a statement rather than a question. "No, madam." "Montana originally, but I've worked ranches from Idaho to Texas." "And what brought you to Cottonwood Creek? It's hardly on the way to anywhere." Elijah chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to rumble from deep in his chest. "Work, mostly." Herd Thompson needed experienced hands for his cattle operation. The railroad making it easier to ship beef east has got ranchers expanding. "Including Blackwood," Rosalyn said bitterly. "I gather he's the reason for your damaged porch." She nodded, seeing no reason to hide what was common knowledge. "Thaddeus Blackwood wants my land. He's been trying to buy it since my parents died, but lately his methods have become more persuasive." "Yet you haven't sold," Elijah observed. "It's my home," she said simply. "Everything my parents worked for. Everything I've worked for." Elijah nodded thoughtfully, but offered no platitudes, for which Rosalyn was grateful. They rode the remaining distance in silence until her small ranch came into view. The Winters property wasn't large by Wyoming standards, just 160 acres with a modest cabin, barn, and corral. But the land was good, with a year-round creek running through it, and enough pasture for her small herd of cattle. Her father had chosen well when he'd claimed it under the Homestead Act 15 years earlier. As they approached the cabin, Rosalyn could see the damage to her porch was even worse than she'd initially thought. One of the support posts had been hit, causing the roof to sag dangerously on one side. Elijah assessed the damage with a professional eye. "Looks like they knew what they were doing," he commented. "Hit a supporting beam, lucky the whole thing didn't collapse." "Nothing about Blackwood's men is lucky," Rosalyn muttered, dismounting. After seeing to the horses, Elijah set to work immediately, measuring and marking the damaged sections that would need to be replaced. Rosalyn worked alongside him, holding boards steady and passing tools when needed. Despite her initial reservations, she had to admit he was skilled. His hands moved with precision and confidence, making quick work of even the most damaged sections. As the afternoon progressed, Rosalyn found herself watching those hands large and calloused from years of ranch work, yet surprisingly dexterous as they shaped wood and drove nails. They were strong hands, capable of hard labor, but there was a gentleness to the way he handled his tools and materials. "You're staring, Miss Winters," Elijah said without looking up from the board he was planing. Rosalyn felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Just making sure you're earning your dollar," she replied, turning away to hide her embarrassment. His low chuckle followed her as she retreated to the well to draw water for dinner. By sundown, the porch was nearly repaired, the new lumber standing out bright against the weathered planks. Rosalyn had to admit it looked better than before Blackwood's men had shot it up. "We'll finish tomorrow," Elijah said, washing his hands in the basin she'd set out. "Need to let some of the joining set overnight." Rosalyn nodded, suddenly aware of the awkwardness of their situation. She hadn't thought through the logistics of hiring a man to work on her property. Would he expect to stay in the cabin? The idea of a male stranger, sleeping under her roof made her uncomfortable. As if sensing her thoughts, Elijah gestured toward the barn. "I'll bed down out there, if that's all right. Used to sleeping rough." Relief flooded through her. "There's clean hay in the loft," she offered, "and I'll bring you some dinner." Later, as they sat on opposite sides of her small kitchen table, sharing a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, Rosalyn found herself curious about the man across from her. "You said you've worked ranches across the West," she began. "Any family waiting somewhere?" Elijah shook his head. "No family. Parents died when I was young, raised mostly by various ranch foremen who took pity on a scrawny kid willing to work. So you've always been on the move?" "Most of my life," he admitted. "Never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots." Something in his tone made Rosalyn wonder if he regretted that fact. She understood the value of roots, of connection to a place. It was what she fought for every day. "And you?" Elijah asked. "Just you out here alone?" "Since my parents died, yes. I have an aunt in Denver, but this is home." She gestured around the simple cabin. "My father built every inch of this place. My mother planted that garden out back and sewed every curtain. Their hands are in everything here." Elijah's gaze softened. "That's worth fighting for." "It is," she agreed quietly. After dinner, Elijah thanked her and retreated to the barn, leaving Rosalyn alone with her thoughts. She hadn't expected to feel so comfortable in his presence, nor had she anticipated how easily conversation flowed between them. There was something different about Elijah weighed a steadiness that contrasted sharply with the volatile men she usually encountered in Cottonwood Creek. As she prepared for bed, Rosalyn found herself glancing out the window toward the barn, wondering about the man who had so unexpectedly entered her life. One thing was certain, having him there made her feel safer than she had in months. The next morning, Rosalyn woke at dawn to find Elijah already at work on the porch. He'd clearly been up for some time, as the remaining repairs were nearly complete. She watched him from the window for a moment, admiring the efficient way he moved and the care he took with each piece of lumber. When she stepped outside with a pot of coffee, he straightened and tipped his hat. "Morning, Miss Winters. Hope I didn't wake you." "I'm usually up with the sun," she replied, pouring him a cup. "The porch looks good. Just needs a bit of paint to match the old boards, but it's sturdy now." won't come down even if those men decide to use it for target practice again. Rosalyn tensed at the reminder of why he was there in the first place. Blackwood's ultimatum 1 week to sell hung over her like a storm cloud. "Thank you for your help," she said formally, suddenly eager to restore the distance between them. Having him here, making her feel safe, was dangerous. She couldn't afford to rely on anyone, especially not a drifter who would move on to the next job when this one was done. Elijah seemed to sense her withdrawal. He accepted the coffee with a nod and returned to his work without another word. They worked in silence through the morning, Rosalyn tending to her chores while Elijah finished the porch and then moved on to fix a broken hinge on the barn door she hadn't even mentioned. By midday, there was little left to repair, and Rosalyn knew she had no excuse to keep him on. She approached him as he was packing his tools, $2 silver in her hand. 2 days' work, as agreed, she said, holding out the money. Elijah looked at the coins but didn't take them. "I didn't finish yesterday. That's only 1 day's wages. You fixed more than was in our agreement." "The barn door, the loose board on the corral, it's fair." He studied her face for a moment before accepting the money with a nod. "Thank you, Miss Winters." As he secured his tools on the packhorse, Rosalyn felt an unexpected pang of regret. Once he rode away, she would be alone again, facing Blackwood's threat with no allies. "What will you do?" Elijah asked suddenly, turning to face her. "About Blackwood and his men?" "What I've always done," she replied, lifting her chin. "Stand my ground against 3 armed men." "That's not standing your ground, Miss Winters. That's suicide." Anger flashed through her. "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Mr. Wade. I've handled Blackwood for 4 years without your help. And how's that working out for you?" he challenged, gesturing toward the newly repaired porch. "They're escalating. Next time they might not aim at the wood." Deep down, Rosalyn knew he was right, but admitting it felt like surrendering. "What would you have me do? Sell my home to a tyrant? Run away?" "I'd have you be smart," Elijah said, his voice softening. "Smart enough to know when to ask for help. There's no help to be had in Cottonwood Creek. The sheriff is in Blackwood's pocket, and everyone else is too afraid to stand against him." Elijah stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "I'm not afraid of Thaddeus Blackwood." Something in his steady blue eyes made Rosalyn believe him, but it didn't matter. "You're passing through, Mr. Wade. This isn't your fight." "It could be," he said quietly. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were coming fast down the trail toward her property, the same 3 who had shot up her porch 2 days earlier. Elijah moved with surprising speed, positioning himself between Rosalyn and the approaching men. His hand rested casually near his holstered revolver, but there was nothing casual about the way he stood, feet planted firmly, shoulders squared. The riders slowed as they approached, clearly surprised to find Rosalyn not alone. The leader, a scar-faced man Rosalyn knew as Jenkins, pulled his horse to a stop several yards away. "Didn't expect company, Miss Winters," he drawled, his eyes moving between her and Elijah. "State your business and move on," Elijah said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. Jenkins smirked. "My business is with the lady, not her hired hand." "I'm listening," Rosalyn said, stepping forward to stand beside Elijah rather than behind him. "Mr. Blackwood sent me to check if you've reconsidered his generous offer. $5,000 for this." Jenkins gestured dismissively at her property. "Patch of dirt. More than fair, considering—" "Considering what?" Elijah asked. "Considering what happens to stubborn folks who don't know what's good for them," one of the other men said with a chuckle. Elijah's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, but Rosalyn sensed the coiled tension in him. "Sounds like a threat," he observed. "Just stating facts," Jenkins replied. "Miss Winters knows the offer expires in 5 days. After that, well," he shrugged. "Accidents happen. You can tell, mister." "Blackwood, my answer hasn't changed," Rosalyn said firmly. "This land isn't for sale, not to him, not to anyone. Jenkins' expression hardened. "You're making a mistake." "The only mistake here," Elijah interjected, "is thinking you can threaten a lady on her own property and ride away without consequences." The three men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. Whatever they saw in Elijah's stance made them reconsider their approach. "We'll be back," Jenkins warned, wheeling his horse around. "Best think on it, Miss Winters." As they rode away, Rosalyn released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Elijah remained motionless until the riders were well out of sight, then turned to her. 5 days, he said grimly. "Not much time." "For what? To pack up my life and surrender?" Rosalyn shook her head. "Never." Elijah studied her for a long moment. "Thompson won't miss me for a few days. I could stay, help you prepare." "Prepare for what, exactly?" "Whatever comes," he replied simply. Rosalyn wanted to refuse. Accepting his help meant acknowledging she couldn't handle this alone, and that admission felt like weakness. But the practical part of her, the part that had kept her alive, and her ranch running for 4 years, recognized the wisdom in his offer. "$1 more a day," she said finally, "and you keep sleeping in the barn." A smile tugged at the corner of Elijah's mouth. "Yes, madam." Over the next 2 days, they worked together reinforcing the cabin and outbuildings. Elijah taught Rosalyn how to create defensive positions, where to store extra ammunition, and the best angles to cover approaches to the property. They took turns keeping watch at night, though Rosalyn suspected Elijah slept little during his off hours. On the 3rd day, they rode into town together to stock up on supplies and, hopefully, speak with Sheriff Miller. The sheriff was in his office this time, but his response to Rosalyn's complaint was exactly what she had expected. "I can't arrest men for trespassing without proof, Miss Winters," he said, leaning back in his chair. "And as for threats, well, sounds to me like they were just delivering a business message." "A business message delivered with bullets," Elijah remarked from where he stood by the door. "Interesting way to conduct negotiations in Cottonwood Creek." Sheriff Miller's eyes narrowed. "Don't believe we've met, mister." Elijah Wade, working for Miss Winters at present. "Hired gun?" the sheriff asked pointedly. "Hired hands," Elijah corrected. "Though I'm capable with a gun when necessary." The tension in the small office was palpable. Sheriff Miller finally sighed and sat forward, addressing Rosalyn. "Look, I understand you're attached to your property, but Blackwood's offer is more than fair. You'd be wise to take it and move somewhere, more suitable for a woman alone." "Thank you for your concern, Sheriff," Rosalyn said coldly, "but I'll decide what's suitable for me." As they left the sheriff's office, Elijah placed a gentle hand at the small of her back, guiding her through the busy street. The simple gesture felt oddly protective, and despite her usual aversion to being touched, Rosalyn found she didn't mind. "He won't help," she said unnecessarily as they tied their purchases to their saddles. "No," Elijah agreed, "but I expected as much. Then why did we bother?" "Because now he knows you didn't come alone. That changes things." "How?" Rosalyn asked skeptically. "It means whatever happens next can't be dismissed as a lone woman's exaggeration. There's a witness now." As they prepared to mount up, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A large man with an elaborate mustache and expensive clothing was emerging from the saloon, flanked by several men including Jenkins. "Blackwood," Rosalyn whispered, instinctively stepping closer to Elijah. Thaddeus Blackwood surveyed the street like a king reviewing his domain. When his gaze landed on Rosalyn, a smile spread across his face that didn't reach his eyes. He said something to his men and began walking toward them. "Miss Winters," he called out jovially. "Just the person I wanted to see." Elijah positioned himself slightly in front of Rosalyn, but she moved to stand beside him, refusing to hide. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged stiffly. "I see you've hired help," Blackwood observed, looking Elijah up and down with obvious disdain. "Waste of good money, if you ask me. That property of yours requires more than one pair of hands to make it profitable." "I'm managing just fine," Rosalyn replied. Word is you're behind on your property taxes. Bank holds the note on your cattle. Winter coming on hard from what I hear. Blackwood shook his head in mock concern. Seems to me $5,000 would solve a lot of problems. The fact that he knew about her financial difficulties wasn't surprising. Blackwood made it his business to know everyone's vulnerabilities, but it was unsettling nonetheless. My answer remains no, Rosalyn said firmly. Blackwood's false smile faded. I don't like being refused, Miss Winters, particularly not by a woman who clearly doesn't understand her position. I understand my position perfectly, Rosalyn countered. I own land you want, and I won't sell it. That's all there is to understand. Several onlookers had gathered, watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. Blackwood was clearly aware of the audience, his next words pitched to Carrie. Your father was a reasonable man. He would have seen the sense in my offer. My father would have seen you for exactly what you are, Rosalyn said, anger overriding caution. A bully who uses intimidation instead of fair business practices. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd. Blackwood's face darkened with anger, but before he could respond, Elijah spoke. I believe the lady has made her position clear, Mr. Blackwood. Perhaps it's time to accept that not everything is for sale. Blackwood turned his attention to Elijah, studying him with newfound interest. And who might you be, aside from someone who should mind his own business? Elijah weighed. And Miss Winters' business is my business at present. Is that so? Blackwood's eyes moved between them, a new calculation evident in his expression. Well, Mr. Wade, you should know that interfering with my affairs has consequences. Men have disappeared in these parts for less. Is that another business message? Elijah asked mildly, though Rosalyn could feel the tension radiating from him. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, neither willing to back down. Finally, Blackwood chuckled, the sound utterly devoid of humor. 2 days, Miss Winters, he said, turning back to Rosalyn. Then my offer expires permanently. With that, he turned and walked away, his men falling in behind him like obedient dogs. The crowd dispersed quickly, no one wanting to be seen sympathizing with Blackwood's opponents. Rosalyn's hands were shaking as she mounted Pepper. The public confrontation had left her feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way the previous threats had not. Elijah rode beside her in silence as they left town, giving her space to collect her thoughts. They were nearly halfway back to her ranch when he finally spoke. He's desperate. Rosalyn glanced at him in surprise. Blackwood, he seemed anything but desperate to me. He made a public threat in front of witnesses, Elijah explained. A man like Blackwood prefers to operate in the shadows. For him to be so bold means he's running out of time or patience, probably both. But why? My land is valuable but hardly essential to his empire. Elijah shook his head. There's something more at play. Has anything changed recently? Any new developments in the area? Rosalyn thought for a moment. The railroad spur. They're planning to extend a line west of town, but the surveys haven't been completed yet. Where would that line run? No one knows for certain, but Rosalyn's eyes widened as understanding dawned. If it follows the creek, it would cut right through my property. Elijah nodded. And a railroad stop would make surrounding land far more valuable if Blackwood knows the planned route. He could buy my land cheaply before anyone else realizes its worth, Rosalyn finished. But how would he know? The railroad hasn't announced anything officially. Men like Blackwood always have sources, Elijah said grimly. Bribes, favors, threats, whatever it takes to stay ahead of everyone else. The pieces were falling into place now. Blackwood's sudden urgency, the escalating threats, the seemingly generous offer for land that had been struggling to turn a profit, it all made sense if he knew something others didn't. What do we do? Rosalyn asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. It was the first time she had acknowledged they were in this together. Elijah's expression softened slightly. We prepare, and when Blackwood makes his move, we're ready. That night, As they sat at her kitchen table cleaning their firearms by lamplight, Rosalyn found herself studying Elijah's face. In just a few days, this stranger had become an ally, putting himself at risk for her land and her cause. She didn't understand it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked abruptly. "You could have ridden away after fixing my porch. This isn't your fight." Elijah's hands stilled on the gun he was oiling. "Maybe I'm tired of seeing the Blackwoods of the world take what isn't theirs simply because they can. There must be more to it than that." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "My parents had a small ranch in Montana," he finally said. "Nothing special, just enough to get by. When I was 10, a mining company found silver in the hills nearby. Suddenly, our worthless patch of dirt was valuable." Rosalyn set down her shotgun, sensing where the story was heading. "They tried to buy us out. When my father refused, there was an accident." His voice remained steady, but his knuckles whitened around the revolver in his hands. "Fire in the night. My parents never made it out of the house." "Elijah, I'm so sorry," Rosalyn whispered. "The company man who came to express his condolences offered to buy the land from me the same day, said it would help with funeral expenses." A bitter smile crossed his face. "I was 10 years old and alone, but even I knew what had happened." "What did you do?" "Ran. Worked ranches, learned to handle myself, promised myself I'd never stand by and watch it happen to someone else." He finally looked up, meeting her eyes across the table. "So no, it's not my fight, but I'm making it mine all the same." In that moment, something shifted between them. Rosalyn saw not just the capable, confident man who had ridden into her life, but the boy who had lost everything to greed and power. She understood now why he had offered his help, why he stood with her against Blackwood. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing no other words could adequately express what she felt. Elijah nodded once, then returned to cleaning his gun, the moment of vulnerability passing but not forgotten. They spent the next day fortifying the cabin further, boarding up windows, and creating firing positions. Rosalyn inventoried her ammunition and provisions, ensuring they could withstand whatever came when Blackwood's deadline expired. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and red across the Wyoming sky, they sat on her newly repaired porch, watching the approaching night. "Do you think they'll come tomorrow?" Rosalyn asked. "No," Elijah replied thoughtfully. "Blackwood will wait until his deadline passes. He's a man who values appearances. In his mind, he gave you a fair chance. And then we'll see what kind of man he truly is." The night passed uneventfully, as did the following day. When Blackwood's deadline came and went with no sign of his men, Rosalyn began to hope that perhaps he had reconsidered. But Elijah remained vigilant, checking and rechecking their defenses, insisting they maintain their watches. It was just after midnight when they came. Rosalyn was dozing in a chair near the fireplace when Elijah's hand on her shoulder startled her awake. "Riders," he whispered. "At least 6, coming fast." Adrenaline surged through her as she grabbed her shotgun and moved to her assigned position near the front window. Through a small gap in the boards, she could see dark figures approaching, the moonlight glinting off metal guns, certainly, but something else too. "They're carrying torches," she hissed. Elijah's face hardened. "Get ready." The riders surrounded the cabin, keeping just out of effective shotgun range. Jenkins' voice called out from the darkness. "Miss Winters, time's up. Mr. Blackwood's offer is withdrawn." "What does he want now?" Rosalyn called back, though she already knew the answer. Now he wants you gone." One way or another. The malice in Jenkins' voice was unmistakable. "But we're reasonable men. You ride out now, leave everything, and you get to live. That's more than fair, I'd say." Elijah moved to stand beside her. "And if she refuses," he shouted. "Then we burn you both out," Jenkins replied. "Your choice." Rosalyn's grip tightened on her shotgun. She had known it might come to this, but facing the reality of it men willing to murder her for a piece of land was still shocking. "What do we do?" she whispered to Elijah. His eyes met hers in the dim light. "We fight, but smart." They expect us to stay inside, to be trapped when they set the fire. We don't give them what they expect." Quickly, he outlined his plan. It was risky, but it was their best chance. Rosalyn nodded her agreement, fear giving way to resolute determination. As Jenkins and his men began to close in, torches held high, Elijah and Rosalyn slipped out the back door of the cabin. Using the darkness and the outbuildings for cover, they separated, moving to flank the attackers. Rosalyn positioned herself behind the well, watching as two men approached the back of her cabin with torches. She waited until they were fully committed, then stood and leveled her shotgun. "Drop those torches," she commanded. The men spun around, one fumbling for his gun. Rosalyn fired, the blast of her shotgun deafening in the night. She hadn't aimed to kill, just to scare, and the pellets struck the ground near the men's feet, sending them scrambling backward. From the other side of the cabin came the sharp crack of Elijah's revolver, followed by a cry of pain. The night erupted into chaos as Jenkins and his men realized they were being flanked. "They're behind us," someone shouted. In the confusion, one of the torches was dropped against the cabin wall. Flames licked eagerly at the dry wood, spreading quickly despite the precautions they had taken. Rosalyn's heart sank as she watched fire claim her home, but there was no time for despair. Jenkins and two others had spotted her and were closing in. She fired again, then ducked behind the well as bullets splintered the wood around her. "Rosalyn?" Elijah's voice cut through the gunfire. "Move to the barn?" She darted from cover to cover, making her way toward the barn as Elijah provided covering fire. One of Jenkins' men went down with a cry, clutching his shoulder. The others fell back, suddenly less eager to press their attack now that they faced determined resistance. Inside the barn, Rosalyn pressed her back against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. Elijah appeared moments later, reloading his revolver with practiced efficiency. "They're regrouping," he said. "Jenkins is hit, but not badly. They'll try again." "My home," Rosalyn whispered, the reality of what was happening finally hitting her. Through the barn door, she could see her cabin engulfed in flames, the fire reaching hungrily toward the night sky. Elijah's expression softened. "I'm sorry, Rosalyn, but we need to focus on surviving right now." He was right, of course. The cabin was lost, but they still had a chance to escape with their lives. Rosalyn squared her shoulders and checked her shotgun. "What's the plan?" "We make for the creek," Elijah said. "Use the trees for cover, work our way toward town. Once we're clear, we can get the sheriff. Even Miller can't ignore armed men burning out a homesteader." It was their best option, but getting to the creek meant crossing open ground. They would be exposed, vulnerable. "Ready?" Elijah asked, his eyes searching hers. Rosalyn nodded, finding strength in his steady gaze. "Ready." They slipped out the back of the barn just as Jenkins and his remaining men began to approach the front. Moving as quietly as possible, they made it halfway to the tree line before a shout went up. "There they are." Gunfire erupted behind them. Elijah pushed Rosalyn ahead of him, using his body to shield her as they ran. They were almost to the trees when Rosalyn heard Elijah grunt in pain. He stumbled but kept moving, urging her forward. Once within the protective cover of the cottonwoods, they paused. In the moonlight, Rosalyn could see blood staining Elijah's left sleeve. "You're hit," she gasped. "Just a graze," he insisted, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "Keep moving." They followed the creek for nearly a mile, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind them. Elijah was slowing, his breathing labored, and when Rosalyn finally insisted they stop, he sank to the ground with obvious relief. "Let me see," she demanded, kneeling beside him. The bullet had torn through the muscle of his upper arm. Not immediately life-threatening, but the blood loss was concerning. Rosalyn tore strips from her petticoat to bind the wound, working quickly in the dim light. "Not how I imagined getting you to tear off your undergarments," Elijah joked weakly. Despite everything, Rosalyn felt a smile tug at her lips. "Behave, Mr. Wade, or I'll leave you for the coyotes." His chuckle turned into a grimace of pain as she tightened the makeshift bandage. When she finished, their eyes met, and something passed between them: gratitude, respect, and something deeper that neither was ready to name. "Thank you," he said softly. Rosalyn nodded, suddenly aware of how close they were, of his hand resting lightly on her arm. "We should keep moving," she said, her voice not quite steady. They continued along the creek, slower now but still putting distance between themselves and Jenkins' men. By dawn, they had reached the outskirts of Cottonwood Creek. The town was just waking up, shopkeepers opening their businesses, ranch hands heading to the saloon after night shifts. Rosalyn and Elijah must have been a sight, clothes torn and dirty, his arm bandaged with her petticoat, both of them exhausted and grim. They made their way directly to the sheriff's office, where Miller was just unlocking the door. His eyes widened at their appearance. "What in God's name? Blackwood's men burned my ranch last night," Rosalyn interrupted. "Shot Mr. Wade, tried to kill us both." Sheriff Miller's expression shifted from surprise to wariness. "Those are serious accusations, Miss Winters." "They're facts," Elijah said firmly. 6 men, led by Jenkins, they came with torches and guns, gave Miss Winters the choice to leave or burn. And you have proof of this." "My burned home is proof," Rosalyn snapped. "Mr. Wade's wound is proof, and if you ride out there now, you'll likely find at least one of Jenkins' men nursing a shotgun wound." Miller sighed, rubbing his jaw. "Even if what you say is true, it is true," Elijah interrupted, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Blackwood is a powerful man. His word against yours won't end well for you." "Then it's fortunate we don't need his word," came a new voice from the doorway. They turned to see a smartly dressed man in his 40s, a notebook in hand. Rosalyn recognized him as Edward Hayes, editor of the Cottonwood Creek Gazette. "Mr. Hayes," Sheriff Miller greeted him warily, "this is a private matter." "Arson and attempted murder are hardly private matters, Sheriff," Hayes replied, stepping into the office. "Especially when the victims are a respected homesteader and a man who happened to save my daughter from being trampled by a runaway horse just yesterday." Elijah looked surprised at this characterization, but Hayes gave him a subtle nod that Rosalyn interpreted as a request to play along. "The Gazette would be very interested in this story," Hayes continued. "As would the territorial governor, I imagine. He's quite concerned about land disputes being settled with violence rather than law." Sheriff Miller's demeanor changed visibly at the mention of the governor. He straightened, suddenly all business. "I'll send deputies out to investigate immediately. In the meantime, Miss Winters, Mr. Wade, I'll need your full statements." As they gave their accounts of the night's events, Rosalyn couldn't help but wonder at their sudden stroke of luck. When Miller stepped out to organize a posse, she turned to Hayes. "Why are you helping us?" she asked quietly. The editor smiled. "Because Thaddeus Blackwood has been running roughshod over this county for too long. Because I believe in justice. And because," he glanced at Elijah, "your friend there really did save my Emily from a nasty accident yesterday. I pay my debts." Elijah nodded his thanks. "We appreciate it, regardless of the reason." "Don't thank me yet," Hayes cautioned. "Blackwood won't take this lying down. He'll deny everything, claim Jenkins acted without his knowledge. It will be your word against his." "Unless Jenkins talks," Rosalyn said thoughtfully. "A man like that doesn't betray his employer," Hayes pointed out. "He might," Elijah said, "if the alternative is hanging for murder." Within hours, Sheriff Miller's posse returned with 3 of Blackwood's men in custody, including Jenkins. One was indeed nursing a shotgun wound to his leg, just as Rosalyn had predicted. The evidence of their attack was irrefutable: the burned cabin, the bullet wounds, and most damning of all, a letter found in Jenkins' pocket instructing him to resolve the Winters situation permanently. The letter was not signed, but the implication was clear. Faced with the evidence and the prospect of being the sole scapegoat, Jenkins broke. He confirmed that Blackwood had ordered the attack, motivated by his knowledge that the railroad spur would cross Rosalyn's property. Thaddeus Blackwood was arrested that afternoon, his protestations of innocence falling on increasingly deaf ears as the story spread throughout Cottonwood Creek. The community, long cowed by his influence, began to speak out about other instances of intimidation and violence. For Rosalyn, the victory was bittersweet. Justice was being served, but her home was gone, reduced to ashes and charred timber. She stood on the porch of the hotel where Hayes had insisted she stay, watching as Blackwood was led to the jail, and felt hollow inside. "It doesn't bring it back, does it?" Elijah said softly, coming to stand beside her. His arm was properly bandaged now, the doctor having pronounced the wound painful but not serious. "No," she agreed. "4 generations of memories, everything my parents built, all gone." "Not everything," he corrected gently. "You still have the land, and with the railroad coming through, you could rebuild. Better than before." Rosalyn turned to look at him, struck by the simple practicality of his perspective. He was right, of course. The land remained hers, and now its value would increase substantially. She could rebuild her home, perhaps even expand her operation with the profits from selling a right-of-way to the railroad. "I never thanked you properly," she said. "For staying, for fighting." Elijah shook his head. "No thanks needed. You would have done the same. Perhaps, but few would have put themselves at risk for a stranger's home." "You're not a stranger anymore, Rosalyn," he said quietly. The way he said her name like it was something precious sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Over the past week, this man had shown her more loyalty and courage than anyone since her father. He had fought for her home, bled for it, when he could have walked away at any time. "What happens now?" she asked, not quite meeting his eyes. "That depends," Elijah replied, "on what you want to happen." The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither had dared voice until now. Rosalyn had spent years keeping people at arm's length, convinced that self-reliance was her only protection in a harsh world. But Elijah had shown her another way that strength could be found in trusting someone worthy of that trust. "I want to rebuild," she said finally. "I want to make something better from what was lost." "I'd like to help," Elijah offered. "If you'll have me." The double meaning in his words wasn't lost on her. Rosalyn studied his face, the earnest blue eyes, the subtle smile that seemed reserved just for her, the quiet confidence that had been her anchor through the chaos of the past days. "I would like that very much," she replied softly. In the weeks that followed, as summer gave way to fall, they began the work of rebuilding. News of Blackwood's arrest and the subsequent revelations about his business practices spread throughout the territory. The railroad confirmed what Jenkins had revealed: the new spur would indeed cross Rosalyn's land, and they were prepared to pay handsomely for the right-of-way. With those funds secured, Rosalyn was able to hire proper builders, though Elijah oversaw every aspect of the construction. The new cabin was larger than her old home, with a stone fireplace and a proper kitchen. Elijah insisted on building a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house, for watching sunsets, he explained, though Rosalyn suspected he simply remembered how much she had loved her old porch. As they worked side by side, their relationship evolved naturally from allies to friends to something deeper. Elijah no longer slept in the barn but in a tent near the construction site. Each evening, they would sit by the campfire, planning the next day's work and sharing stories of their lives. It was during one such evening, with the first snow of winter dusting the distant mountains, that Elijah finally spoke of what had been growing between them. "I've been thinking," he began, poking at the fire with a stick. "A dangerous pastime," Rosalyn teased. He smiled, the firelight playing across his features. "I've been moving from place to place most of my life, never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home." Rosalyn's heart quickened. "And now I'm thinking I'd like to stop moving," he said, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. "If I had a reason to stay." "What kind of reason did you have in mind?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah set aside the stick and moved to sit beside her on the log she'd been using as a bench. Gently, he took her hands in those strong, capable hands that had rebuilt her home and defended her land. "You," he said simply. "You're the reason, Rosalyn. I love you. I think I started falling for you the moment you haggled me down to $1 a day." A laugh escaped her, though tears pricked at her eyes. "I was being practical." "You were being you," he corrected, squeezing her hands. "Strong, independent, uncompromising, everything I've come to love." Rosalyn looked down at their joined hands, hers small, but roughened by years of hard work, his large and powerful, yet holding hers with such tenderness. All her life, she had believed that gentleness was a luxury she would never know, that survival in this harsh land required hardness in all things. Yet here was Elijah, who could face down armed men without flinching, but treated her with a gentleness that made her heart ache. He had shown her that strength and tenderness could exist together, that one did not diminish the other. "I always said I'd never know gentle hands in this life," she admitted softly. "That the West was too harsh for softness." "And now," he prompted, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Now I know better," Rosalyn said, looking up to meet his gaze. "You've proven me wrong, Elijah Wade. And I love you for it." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. He leaned forward, hesitating just a breath away from her lips, giving her the chance to pull away if she wished. Instead, Rosalyn closed the distance between them, sealing their declaration with a kiss that held both the tenderness she had discovered and the passion that had been building between them. When they parted, Elijah pressed his forehead to hers. "Marry me," he whispered. "Build a life with me here. Let me show you gentleness every day for the rest of our lives." "Yes," Rosalyn answered without hesitation. In his arms, she had found not just safety but a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. He had never tried to take over her fight or make her decisions. He had simply stood beside her, offering his strength when she needed it, trusting her to do the same for him. They were married that December in the newly completed cabin, with Hayes and his family as witnesses. The editor had become a friend and ally, using his newspaper to champion their cause and help bring Blackwood to justice. The former land baron now awaited trial in the territorial capital, his empire crumbling as more victims came forward. As winter settled over the Wyoming landscape, Rosalyn and Elijah found warmth in the home they had built together. Each evening, they would sit on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and each other's arms, watching the stars emerge in the vast sky above their land. "Any regrets?" Elijah asked one night, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Rosalyn considered the question, thinking of all that had happened since that day by the well when Blackwood's men had first fired upon her porch. She had lost her family home, true, but gained so much more justice, respect from the community, and most precious of all, Elijah's love. "Not one," she replied, nestling closer to him. "Though I do wonder sometimes what would have happened if you hadn't stopped to help that day." "I would have found another excuse," he admitted with a chuckle. "I saw you in town the day before, arguing with Grayson about the price of nails. You were so fierce, so determined, I knew then I had to meet you." "So you were planning to court me all along?" Rosalyn asked, surprised. "Court you?" "I was just hoping you wouldn't shoot me on sight." His laughter rumbled through his chest against her ear. "But yes, I suppose I was hoping for a chance to know you better." "Well, Mr. Wade, I'd say your plan worked admirably," she said, tilting her face up for a kiss that he gladly provided. As spring returned to the land, bringing new growth to replace what winter had buried, the railroad construction began in earnest. The line would pass along the eastern edge of their property, far enough from the house to avoid the noise, but close enough to make shipping cattle to market far more efficient. With the compensation from the railroad and the growing success of their expanded cattle operation, Rosalyn and Elijah were able to hire several hands to help with the work. Their ranch, now known as Double W, became one of the most prosperous in the county. In the years that followed, they would face challenges: drought, harsh winters, cattle thieves, but they faced them together, with the same determination and mutual support that had defined their relationship from the beginning. And when their first child was born, a daughter with Elijah's blue eyes and Rosalyn's auburn hair, they named her Hope, for what they had found in each other when all seemed lost. On warm summer evenings, they would still sit on that wide porch Elijah had insisted on building, watching their children play in the yard where once Rosalyn had faced down threats alone. Her hand would find his, their fingers intertwining in that familiar, comforting way. "You were right, you know," she would sometimes say, watching as he gently rocked their youngest son to sleep in his strong arms. "About what?" he would ask, though he knew the answer. "About gentle hands," Rosalyn would reply, smiling at the life they had built together. "I never thought I'd know them in this harsh land, but you took mine and proved me wrong." And Elijah would simply smile and squeeze her hand in response, the gesture saying more than words ever could about the journey that had brought them here, from strangers facing danger to partners sharing a life, from distrust to the deepest love, from solitude to family. In the heart of the Wyoming wilderness, they had found in each other what the West often seemed determined to destroy: tenderness, compassion, and the gentle touch that heals rather than harms. And in finding it, they had not been weakened but strengthened, their love as enduring as the land they had fought for, and now passed on to their children. For Rosalyn, who had once believed gentleness was a luxury she could never afford, Elijah's love was the most precious gift, proof that even in the wildest places, the human heart could find its home in another's careful hands.